Let's start off childhood years. Your father was an educator, he was a minister, he was a social worker, and that work kept you all pretty busy as a result of his work. You traveled around quite a bit.
That's
How
true.
how did those early childhood experiences prepare you for challenges that you would face when you got a little older?
Well, probably certainly not knowing it at the time, the activities that we became involved in kind of broadened the perspective, getting into and being led into both church activities, which my father's involved in, instilled certain values, getting into Boy Scouts even more. So together these things accumulated and kind of put the background that I look back now and became the things that guided me through life, respecting others, walking straight and tall to gain respect, helping others. Those types of things just became a part of everyday experience.
Now, what was your earliest recollection? Because with those values, I mean, I would think, expect to be treated a certain way, but then what was your earliest recollection of race being a factor in the way you were treated?
Pretty much the attitudes of people and the fact that when you went to the theater, although we lived in a town where you could, you had to go sit in the balcony in those early days. I later learned that although my scouting experiences were all positive, but some of it was due to people who realized that everyone should be treated equally, and they were able to, if you will, be a buffer between some of the things that could have happened. And you had the usual thing often on the streets among those that wanted to throw around names and that type of thing, and certainly my church experience and so on. So, I like the old saying, sticks and stones will break my bones, but names won't hurt me any. So that became just a way that I looked at things.
Now, it's certainly, I would think, a lot easier to dismiss name calling and that sort of thing as just sheer ignorance. But as I said, your father was an educator, and you saw education as definitely a way out to certainly a better life, a better lifestyle. How did you handle it when it became apparent that there was bias in the educational system itself, that you were taught was basically the way to go?
I think other than repeating third grade because of the difference in the schools in the South where my dad had spent a year in Florida versus the schools in Ohio and then later in the Middle West, I was really rather fortunate that although there was segregation in the school, still it didn't hinder the education that I received. Is the way I look at it. I can look at my years, a couple of years in high school, about 2.5 in Iowa. Iowa had very excellent schools, and although in school activity we might be relegated to singing a song in the play that might be put on, certainly no lead part. Those things took place, but it didn't hinder the education in the sciences and math and the courses that were being. So I feel fortunate from there, from that point of view. So if there were any hurts, it was more in the social and life outside of school that it had some impact rather than really on getting the education, and the fact that as education was a hallmark to being prepared for advancement, the segregation wasn't a hindrance.
Were you recognized for your educational accomplishments, like, for example, as you mentioned, during your high school
Well, I
days
think
in
there
Iowa?
were. I think there were times there was some recognition, but perhaps not on the level that it should have been. I had folks tell me after that, well, you should have been gotten the top award. So there was recognition, but at some lesser level often. In even I can remember someone coming to me saying on a civics award, and that's for participation and helping others and that type of thing. That it was like getting honorable mention when others said, no, you should have been in contention. Well, it didn't happen, but it didn't deter me from continuing on the trend that I'd established or that I was doing. And it wasn't something being done to say, well, now if you do this and this and this, you're going to arrive at some place. It was just a way of life that I developed to treat others as I wanted to be treated, and hopefully that respect would come in time.
And it paid off. I mean, in high school, you finished pretty well, didn't you?
I did. Fortunately, when we look back on it, I was very high in the class of some 400 graduates, and that was a good feeling, and it certainly opened up the opportunity to be accepted at college level.
And you went on to the University of Illinois.
Yes, I did have to work a year to be able to do that because we didn't have a lot of money, and it took a year of work, but I was able to save during that year and enter school a year after graduating from high school.
And now you were initially studying engineering.
That's correct.
Why engineering?
Well, the year of work really brought in a little focus to the engineering field that I had done, and that so it was, I guess you still kind of immediate and a way to go. And I also enrolled in the ROTC program because by that time the rumblings of war were certainly about, and the fact that we did have to register for the draft, although initially if you were in school they weren't pushing to take you out of school to enter the service.
Well, now, before we get to the draft, when you got to the University of Illinois, you stayed the course as you'd been doing in your previous years as a high school student, pretty studious, but there was one person who managed to turn your head.
Oh, I guess you, speaking of meeting the young lady at that time that turned out to be my wife of over 50 years, yes. Campus life has a way of bringing folks together, and between, we'd always had a discussion of when did I really first meet her, but it was one of those things going down the broad walk on the campus and seeing somebody that attracted you and turning around, and we both had turned around to look and said, well, maybe we need to get acquainted, and fortunately through attending church activity in town, not on campus, we did subsequently meet.
Now, initially though, it wasn't that smooth, was it? Didn't you have to do some pursuing of Miss Francis for a little bit?
Well, yes, because in those days the Saturday, Friday night and Saturday dances were a big thing, and I had become an alpha at that time in Tall Chapter, were noted as the studious ones, if you will. And one of the other fraternities was more the fun group, and that's where folks gathered. Dancing and jitterbugging was a bit of the craze, and I didn't do much of that then, but I figured I'd have to learn, and did finally get her attention, I guess would be a way of saying it.
Now, after you did get her attention, how did you manage to maintain a relationship in college where, I mean, I know being a university student, you don't have any money, and time is at a minimum. So, I mean, how did you all manage that?
Well, in fact, I think it was good for me too, because Frances was very studious, and so we found that meeting in the library was a good opportunity that you could be together but still accomplishing aims, and so that was kind of the way it started, that we could meet, and then the occasional other times social activity, but it was pretty much on business basis, if you will. We're here to study first, and we can get acquainted while doing that, and moving on from there to more serious considerations, which came a couple of years later.
And of course, the library dates are a lot less inexpensive.
That very, very true, because it was, I worked through the summers to get money for college. My dad by that time had moved to Gary, Indiana, and fortunately there were opportunities in the steel mill there, and the pay was such that you could, saving it, which I did. In fact, I even went on I called the graveyard shift. That way, keep me out of Chicago and the night spots, and I could, because I'd have to be at work, and these places weren't open through the day, so I'd get my rest and put the money in the bank. So it paid off to be able to get back to school and renew. Of course, we communicated by letter for summers, and the spark was still there, so it came on to just before my being called into the service, because I had taken the exam when I learned of the program and was accepted, and so we decided to get married since I was going to be called into the service.
Let me ask you about that. Well, first, it was December 7th, 1941, your 22nd birthday.
Yes.
And you were actually on your way to church with your glee club.
That's right.
Could you even fathom how your life was going to change when you heard that Japan bombed Pearl Harbor?
Not really. We knew this was meant some major changes in our country and what was going on because of the buildup that had been going on to support our allies in Europe. But we knew this would bring about some kind of major change, but no real vision of what was to come.
Now, you had heard rumblings about there being a black flyer program. You know, there were rumors and stuff when you got back to school.
Yes.
And then you ultimately decided to apply for it. But up until, because, you know, I read that book.
Yeah,
and up until that point, you expressed no interest, or at least it wasn't written about, in flying. So what made you
No, I had never been around aircraft, and used to make little paper airplanes in schools. I would say that you'd throw and deny the teacher that you had anything to do with it. But I'd not been around an airfield or aircraft, but my studies and my experience in the ROTC, certainly I was also a member of Pershing Rifles and could handle that aspect of handling a rifle pretty well, but I didn't envision it being very pleasant to be out in the muddy fields and the types of things that was very apparent, the life of a foot soldier and an infantryman, if you will. Of course, I didn't know where I might be drafted, but learning that there were lots of rumors around Champaign-Urbana because they had picked Chanute Field that was 14 miles away. The Army Air Corps Technical School was where the non-flying officers and the mechanics for that first squadron, the 99th Squadron that had been authorized, that their mechanics and technicians were being trained at Chanute. And there was even among the church folks and so on and the people in town, a number who were taking advantage of that opportunity to go up and try to enlist for that purpose, since it was close to home for those. And I even thought about that, but realized that just from my technical training and what I was in, that there was something inviting about being a pilot, that I said, comparing what might happen if I were drafted, I said, I'll volunteer for my hands up. Right. You never raise your hand, but you go sign that piece of paper.
So you ultimately applied, and you went to Northern Illinois to take the physical exam and the written exam. Now,
Yeah, the written was Illinois, and the medical happened in northern Indiana.
Okay.
It was I guess the way the regional structure, and it happened that I was assigned to go. I can't remember whether it was Fort Wayne, but it was in Indiana that I went, and that was in the spring of '42, and was accepted and had passed the mental and the physical exams.
But that was an experience in itself, was it not? Because the people administering the test weren't exactly aware that we were suddenly in the business of training black pilots.
No, they certainly weren't. I think if I recall, even one of the technicians, because they had not been used to handling Negroes, as the term used then, in programs, and on some of the papers even wrote white because he was just so used to doing it, hadn't paid any attention. But the proof of the pudding that segregation was still there was that even though accepted there in April, it was several months later before the call came that shunted me down to Tuskegee, Alabama.
Now, it must have been kind of, I don't know, nail-biting for you, waiting, because there was a certain period of time you took the physical and you took the written exam, but there was a period of time where you had to wait to find out if you'd even pass. And during that time, you were eligible for the draft.
That's correct.
So
Yeah.
how did you get through that, and how did you manage to avoid the draft?
Well, at the time, I had no way of really knowing how I managed to avoid it, but a number of years later, I learned that one of the ladies, of course, that was a civilian function in the cities where at age you signed up and they kept the cards, and there were periodic calls, and understand that knowing that I had been accepted for this aviation training, and there was a lot of support that opportunity be made available, that my card might have been held back when those subsequent calls came for a few more to report in to assure that I didn't get the call before the call to get into the cadet training came about. So I guess it's good that members of the church were also active in the community on things like that, but I didn't know that at the time. And,
put that so delicately, Colonel McGee, might have been held back, your card. You had some people pulling for you.
Yes, indeed.
Now, in 1942, you returned to school, and you and Francis had some serious decisions to make about your continued progress in school at that point, and really about your future together.
We certainly did. We had, I guess, decided we were for each other and supportive. And because of the expectation of going in, we had decided to get married rather than put it off, not knowing which way that'd go and what that might mean. And so in that fall, well, I guess during the summer, we made the decision. We decided that we would get married, and that when the call came, I would answer it, and she had graduated. She had entered her college, although we got out of high school the same year. She had gone right into college, so she was completing her degree at the time I was ready to start my third year. And that, as I say, we decided to get married, which we did, and I think the first piece of mail that I got after that was, you'll be welcome to enter the Cadet Corps, and with a date, and so I terminated my school activity in preparation for going down to Tuskegee in November of '42.
Turned out to be a really timely decision.
Yes,
Yeah.
and so I entered, and of course Frances, having graduated, decided that she would go south with me.
Yeah.
And I guess that's the term of relative newlyweds. We had to be together as much as we could, not knowing what the war experience might bring about. And so when we arrived at Tuskegee, of course, my time was immediately taken with cadet activities, but she was able to get a job working as a secretary for, well, it was Dr. Kenny, who was head of the Tuskegee Institute Hospital.
I wanted to ask you about that, Francis' decision to join you down there in Tuskegee. That trip down there was quite a rude awakening for you all. I mean,
yeah.
what was it about that trip that made you truly know that you were on your way and had arrived in the South, the segregationist South?
Well, I think the first big change came was when on the train you hit a certain point there in southern Illinois that you had to go to a certain section of the train and that would be your seat for the rest of the trip, which didn't include dining car and that type of thing because of the nature segregation. I guess they call that the Mason-Dixon line, and when you cross that line, the rules of the social activity in the South took over, and we were really much aware of the segregation, and of course had heard a lot of things, so you're somewhat prepared for it, but not prepared.
Yeah, weren't your seats by the engine of the train or something?
Well, that was forward. It was a forward car, coach car, which was right behind the engine. Of course, that's the one that took the most of the soot and smoke and so on, depending on what the winds were doing and the speed of the train. It was very evident that in that portion, but that's where we were relegated to sit for the remainder of the trip.
Now, up until this point, and I'm going to ask you this question again later on in the interview, but up until this point, you basically lived your life by the motto, short-term discomfort for long-term gain when it came to situations like that. But now you were in a situation where it wasn't just you. You were traveling with your new bride. Did you ever think for a moment, you know what, this isn't worth it?
I don't know. We never had a discussion, or it never came across my mind that that things were that bad, I guess is a way of putting it. I think we both had, from our religious training, a bit of faith that the better will prevail in time, and that it was still important to carry yourself in a manner that would garner respect without losing your dignity and so on. So I think that's what carried us through, and we didn't really look at it that where would we go that things weren't a whole lot different, so we had to march on where we were.
So now you get to Tuskegee and you begin your training. How tough was that training?
Very rigorous, and very much controlled from early morning to evening, really 7 days a week, but I did get a few hours Sunday afternoon to be able to spend with the wife. She was able to find a room in the campus area, and we were able to, she could monitor what was going on, but we weren't together except for those few hours Sunday afternoon. But the training was extremely rigorous and was really putting us into shape. In fact, when it was over, I have often said I don't think we were ever in better physical condition than when you completed the cadet training. And of course it was dual. We were being trained as soldiers, if you will, and because we would accept a commission at the completion training as along with the pilot training. So we had the phases from pre-flight training, then into primary, which was our first introduction to flying, and then basing and advance in our graduation. So
The first introduction to flying now.
Yes.
What was that like? I mean, up until this point, you know, you had all the book knowledge down, you were in great physical shape, but now it was time to do the thing.
Do the thing,
It was time for you to do it. What was that like?
Well, my first few flights were rather interesting and probably had to be shortened a little bit because I was having a little queasy stomach with the flying, but in talking to the flight surgeon, they found out they just said quit eating anything, as we would say, greasy foods, but quit the bacon and the sausage and that type of food for breakfast, and that worked. The queasiness went away, and those first experiences, I remember the first flight when my instructor, Jim Wright, said, "You see the air base they were building, the air base had been built and was about complete, but our primary flying was done by Tuskegee Institute at their Moton Field, which was about 9 miles from the Army airfield." And he said, "You see the airfield over there?" I'm not sure what I saw. I think I said yes, but it took a while before you could bring things into focus and get used to being off the ground and in the air and looking over several miles of space rather than just what's right immediately around you.